Yeah.
Go, you're live.
Okay. Welcome everybody tonight on this wonderful May the 1st evening. We had the sun here in Glasgow. I hope you had it where you are. This is a traditional International Workers' Day demonstration. Demonstrations take place on this day. And today, all over Scotland, there were actions, small and big, on the question of independence for Scotland and a referendum, Indy Ref 2. And thanks to everybody who took part in those activities, which hopefully you'll be able to see photos and videos on the Now Scotland website. And if not, get involved in Twitter, all the rest of it. We've had a fantastic day of protest and demonstration. Tonight, we've got some speakers to discuss the question of how to break up the British state and whether or not these the activities of speakers and our organisations that they're involved in and how they can contribute to that fight. And we want to make sure that you, the audience, contribute to that discussion after our speakers have been speaking for about 5 minutes each. I'll be hoping that you're going to pour your questions in about our fight for independence and about the dissolving of the British state. And I'll put those questions to our speakers as well. But feel free to come in and use the chat or the chat facility on Zoom. And hopefully we'll have a very, very constructive discussion and take this movement forward. So we've got 5 speakers here from all different parts of this disunited kingdom. We've got Sean Jobbins from Yes Cymru. We've got Gerry Carroll from Northern Ireland People Before Profit. We've got Garry Tregidga of All Under One Banner Kernow from Cornwall. Amanda Burgauer from the Common Weal. She's the interim director of Common Weal in Scotland. And we've also got George Kerevan, who's the co-convener of Now Scotland. And I'll take them in that order to speak for about 5 minutes. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to ask Sean Jobbins from Yes Cymru to start us off. Thank you, Sean.
No, Shwai, not with that. So I'm Sean Jobbins. Yes Cymru is a non-party political mass movement for an independent way. So we're making a case for independence. We're not standing in election in Thursday, which confuses some people. So we're trying to make the case for independence. And so far it's been going very well. Now, unlike certainly in Scotland, the argument for independence was never really made in Wales for lots of different reasons, which I won't go into this evening. But when we founded in 2016, partly inspired, or very much inspired by Scotland, we thought there needed to be someone making a political case in the political arena, if you like. And even if it's just a small movement, that case has to be made. So someone has to make the maximalist position. And we found that actually that position is more popular as time goes on. So we have a little graph which we put up yesterday on our Twitter and Facebook, and support for independence is now around 32–33% consistently in the polls. So the last one was 32, the one before that 37. So they go up and down a bit. And that's because we're starting to making the case. I think at the outset, I'd say this, we're talking about breakup of the UK, but Britain will still be there. So the landmass will still be there. Much of the culture, which people like, the comedy, the music, the films, the TV will still be there. People will still fall in love with someone from another part of this island, and people will still travel and work, whatever. So I think it's important for people to understand that, because we've seen today in Wales that a Lib Dem candidate has said there needs to be passports to go to England, which is absolutely ridiculous. People are not talking about this. There will be a Welsh passport, of course, but there will be an understanding between our nations on this island about how that works out. To make the case for independence, as we've learned, and this is our experience, maybe different from different places, is you need to make the case. You don't have to win 100% of the people. You don't really have to win 80% of the people. If 60% of the people support you, you win the referendum and you win the agenda. So I think that's quite important. I think in Wales, we always felt that everyone had to agree with independence, and that's never going to happen. That never happens in any country. So, but by making the case, you do two things. One, you're showing supporters that this is not something to be embarrassed of or be afraid of, which is certainly the case in Wales. And two, you're actually creating an agenda. And politics is quite funny because it is a lot of things. And one thing it is also entertainment. I don't mean this lightly on a flippant way, but if politics isn't interesting, if it's not colourful, if it's not noisy and musical, then people will follow something else which is. And part of the thing we saw in Wales, and this is again different to Scotland, Brexit became that noisy carnival for a section of people which they felt answered a lot of questions. I'm not going to go into the argument of Brexit, yes or no. We have members who supported Brexit and members who didn't. But setting the agenda then gives you the context where people make the decision. And that's what happened in Scotland in 2014. And the years leading up to that, you set an agenda, and a noisy and colourful one, which then decides what context people discuss politics. So that's what Yes Cymru is about. We try to do different things. We had a Yestival about a month ago where we discussed issues to do with personal identity, with race, and with LGBTQ questions, all kind of things. We're going to be organising another one in the economy next. Even during, well, the soft lockdown, we've been holding banners on bridges, so some of those will be going on today. But we're looking to hold a big mass national event in August, where hopefully we'll be travelling around Wales, making the argument for independence in the squares and villages of Wales. And we're looking to hold more gigs and stuff like that. So we have to do something which is exciting, which is colourful, which is inclusive. And this is a good thing in Wales. When we started, there was a concern maybe that, again, and like Scotland, that maybe the language issue would divide people, because that has been used in Wales, much maybe like the orange card as in Ireland, to divide people, to create fear where there wasn't fear. That hasn't happened for lots of different reasons, but I hope our culture and the name of our movement, Yes Cymru, implies that it's a bilingual movement that is welcoming to all. So people that don't speak Welsh are very welcome and play a very important part in it, as well as people who do speak Welsh, and Welsh language is an integral part of what we do. And there's a video which we posted yesterday, a new song, No Star, Rule Britannia, so No Star is good night in Welsh, so No Star, Rule Britannia. If you go on Facebook and on Twitter, you'll find this. It's a bilingual song, again, basically saying, goodbye, Rule Britannia. We don't want to rule the waves, we just want our Cymru back. And these are kind of songs and poetry which we need, because the Welsh March for Independence will be the singing revolution, like the Baltic states. It will be a peaceful one, it will be a happy one, it will be a noisy and be a colourful one. But we want to draw on a strength which we have, which is things like music, and draw people together. The great thing is we're seeing now in the polls, and I may be finished with this, something like half young people in Wales now support independence. So I think the last one was 53%, 16 to 24-year-olds. These can go up and down, I understand that. And the case maybe with younger people is a softer vote as well. So we're not under any illusion. Independence is not going to happen tomorrow, but you're creating a broad basis for that. So our supporters come from Plaid Cymru, the Welsh National Party, of course. Also, about 51% of people who voted Labour in 2019 in Wales said they would vote for independence in Wales. We have the Green Party in Wales who vote for independence, and from the other parties taking interest. So it's a long journey. We've got a lot of work to do. We're on about a third of Welsh people now supporting independence. It's a big step, I think, to get the next third, but that's what we're working on. And we have a lot of people in what we call in Wales indie curious. They're asking questions, they're interested, and we need to make sure that they feel comfortable and that independence and Yes Cymru is a warm house for them to feel comfortable in. So any questions you can ask and check it after that. I'll finish with this. We sell a lot of stuff in our shop. And this is very important visually and also to bring income into the movement.
Okay. Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much. Interesting points there, some of which we recognise as issues in now Scotland, and making the case for independence. You would think that that was already well down the line in Scotland, as our main political party is supposed to be for it, but we're finding that we have to make the case for independence now. Anyway, thank you very much for that, and we'll come back to you later. Okay, our next speaker is Gerry Carroll. Again, the question of independence. This is not, Gerry's an elected member of the Northern Ireland Assembly, although he's not met recently. And obviously, the question of independence very much to the fore in Ireland at the moment, and the north, the south, etc. Interesting times there. Gerry, can I ask you to give us a little introduction for 4 or 5 minutes?
Yep, thank you, and good evening and solidarity to everybody in Scotland, from West Belfast and from the north of Ireland. I mean, obviously, I'm sure people have seen that the north has been in the news in the last few weeks, down to sort of an increase in rioting, sectarian tensions, and sort of behaviour that maybe many people would have thought was consigned to history. And, you know, in many ways, that activity has been stoked up by the DUP in particular. MP Sammy Wilson calling for guerrilla warfare, an exact quote, in relation to resisting the protocol, and a way to try and stoke up tension to stop the DUP from hemorrhaging votes, and to try and cover their tracks for their disastrous COVID policies, and their generally disastrous policies, from economics straight through to other political questions. And obviously, Arlene Foster stepping down, and I'm sure you'll join me in not shed any tears for Arlene, because her role in office, despite recent attempts to describe her as a liberal, she was anything but. You know, she was in cahoots with Poots and all these people for many years. But in that situation in the north, there's a tendency and a pushback to say, you know, things are on edge, which that's true. Things are, tensions are high, which they are. But now is not the right time to talk about a border poll, or to talk about ending the border in Ireland, and all these kind of points are made sort of ad nauseum. And I think obviously that's a real pressure we're faced with in the north, but it's a mistaken, I think, an incorrect approach to take. And I could go through it at length, but I know time is limited this evening. But I want to touch on some reasons why I think that is the case. I mean, we're almost approaching the 100th anniversary of partition of Ireland. And it's worth just remembering what that meant. And that meant a southern state which was ruled by the church, by the banks, and really did nothing tangible to improve the conditions and lives of working class people in the south of Ireland. In the north, there was obviously a deeply sectarian state that, in the main, and as a first protocol, discriminated against Catholics, denying jobs, supporting people getting kicked out of their homes, and pogroms as the state was founded. But also, this was a state that used sectarianism to push down conditions of working class Protestants, their jobs, their houses, and so on and so forth. And a lot of that is being questioned now, partly because of Brexit, partly because of Scotland, partly because of people are fed up with the Tories and Boris Johnson and so on and so forth. And obviously, you know, Boris Johnson has said there won't be a border poll for a very, very, very long time, was his quote last week. But more and more people in the north are questioning the fact that, you know, why do we have to be ruled effectively in many ways by London, even though devolution does exist. We're being dictated to by London in many, many ways. And that's not clear cut. It's not plain sailing, but that's a positive, because traditionally it was people mainly from nationalist communities in the north were the main people who were pushing for United Ireland. More and more people from sort of liberal Protestant backgrounds, or people who maybe came from a unionist with a small u background, are questioning that position. And I think just to kind of wrap up, I think the job for socialists and the left in Ireland in the north is not to see United Ireland over here and improving conditions for people over there. We have to mar the two together, we have to fuse them together. And for us and people before profit, the point is that, you know, if we want to change people's lives fundamentally, if we want to overturn the apple cart, we want to make sure there's an All-Ireland NHS, that there's abortion rights north and south, and there's rights for the LGBT plus community, and many more issues. We have to fuse the project of United Ireland with social questions front and centre, and we've seen over years where there was campaigns north and south for abortion rights, where there's campaigns for LGBT rights north and south, and those campaigns were campaigns of United Ireland, and our job is to kind of fuse those movements together, to not put them on hold, and to kind of kick them into action now to ensure that United Ireland is taking place, but it's one where socialist policies, left-wing policies are front and centre. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerry. Yes, the fusing, if you like, of economic issues to do with austerity, the effects of Brexit, with the political, very much the case here as well, I think. And I think interesting as well, connecting with what Sean was saying earlier, the role of youth in bringing these movements forward. Fantastic, thanks very much. Okay, Garry. Garry is from All Under One Banner in Kernow in Cornwall. So this is going to possibly be a new issue for many of us on this call. So on you go, Garry.
Tregidga, good evening in the Cornish language. Before actually talking about the present, I thought it might be just useful for people watching tonight to learn a little bit about the past. In 1889, Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister, declared that if Scotland, Wales and Ireland were to be granted Home Rule, then Cornwall could not be excluded, because on grounds of culture and history it had just as much right as the other Celtic nations. His comments did not indicate genuine support. He was simply using the Cornish case to argue against the challenge to the unitary nature of British politics. But over 130 years later, and many of us in the Cornish movement feel that if the British state is to be dismantled, then Kernow should also gain autonomy. For decades, we suffered from some of the highest unemployment in the UK. That aspect might have improved, but the long-term consequences remain. We still have the lowest incomes in the state, at the same time as local families effectively priced out of the housing market by second homes and external market forces. Farming and fishing are in decline, whilst the real profits from tourism flow outside the region into England. In 2014, the Cornish were recognised as an ethnic minority, but our Celtic land is still regarded officially as part of England, and the devolution package given in 2015 to Cornwall Council is minuscule even compared to Wales and Scotland, leaving us powerless, for example, to even control planning in our own land. But what of the future? I've recently become associated with Cornwall AUOB. I'm also standing for Mebby and Kernow in the forthcoming elections. The elections on Thursday for Cornwall Council would tell us whether the Conservatives with their unionist agenda will benefit from the first past the post electoral system, which obviously we're suffering from compared to Wales and Scotland, and gain a majority, or whether there will be a more balanced council, including a few more seats for Mebby and Kernow, the Cornish party. One of the other things to actually consider is how we translate the growing revival into Cornishness at the cultural level into practical politics. And that's where we've opened that Cornwall AUOB, linking in things like music, language, culture, and community can actually generate change. There's another factor. The cultural current fragmentation of the British state does have implications for us. Out campaigning recently, I was talking to a local farmer, and he told me that, well, he didn't really want to see Scotland leave the UK, but if Scotland and Wales go, then so should Cornwall, since he certainly didn't want to be seen as English. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Garry. Interesting. Thank you very much. Short and sweet there. Okay, next is Amanda from Weal. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you, Charlotte. So I'm Amanda Burgauer. I'm interim director at Weal and a long-time campaigner for Scottish independence. Weal is a people-powered think and do tank that develops policy on and campaigns for social and economic equality, for well-being and the environment, for quality of life, and for social justice in Scotland. When I was invited to speak tonight, I read the title, Making the Case for Self-Determination, and I thought, really? we're still having to make the case after years of independence activism. And I'll be honest, that's incredibly depressing. But of course, that's exactly what we failed to do since 2014, or we'd already be living in an independent country.
Yeah.
Self-determination shouldn't need any defense. In fact, we often hear that it's generally accepted as a legal right of peoples. But that's actually a simplification of a complex situation for those of us in the devolved nations of the United Kingdom. Within the UK polity, the population could be described as democratically represented. Although I'm going to leave the first past the post system for another debate, perhaps with Garry, to talk about that. But however, it's increasingly evident that the political views of the different parts of the UK, and they are very different, are ignored and outvoted by those parts with higher population. And that leads to an inherent lack of democracy for everyone else. And if we think back to the Scottish independence referendum of 2014, where we failed to garner sufficient support, the promises made to Scotland within the UK during the campaign were swiftly rewarded the very next day with English votes for English laws, and evil legislation that ensured Scotland would have no say at Westminster on very many important issues, even when the outcome would affect Scottish budgets for years to come. And to be honest, it's only gone downhill from there. We've been forced to Brexit, despite our 62% majority to remain in the EU. And we've been given a stern warning in the shape of the Internal Markets Bill, which threatens the very principles of devolution and allows Westminster to interfere with and change policy on devolved matters. And it's really important that we pay attention. So for me, the question isn't about, do we need self-determination? But rather, what do we need to do to convince a strong majority by the next independence referendum? And that's coming. And the first thing must be to stop our obsession with trying to convince a small number of older, affluent voters while ignoring the half of Scotland that earns less than 27,000 median salary per year. We need to recognize that the slogans like decisions in our hands doesn't mean much to families who are struggling to put food on the table. And we need to recognize that when we're faced with a new electricity bill, people don't immediately think, oh, if only energy policy was devolved. So part of the success of the Yes campaign was driven by people who weren't engaged in the usual politics and people from those lower income groups. And we need to recognize the frustration from those people and the feeling that their life hasn't got any better for them since 2014. The Commonweal's been involved with focus groups that have confirmed that people get really nervous about independence if they think it hasn't been thought through. Evasive answers or saying that we'll sort it out later don't increase the desire for self-determination. We need to make independence relevant to people's lives, that gives them hope for concrete personal benefits, that their lives will improve. And there are many ways to do that. We need a detailed plan, and that's the work that Commonweal's been doing. I'll recommend 2 of our books here that are available on our website. One is Our Common Home, and the other is Starting a New Country. Do you know, if we got everyone in the higher income bracket to vote yes, every single one of them, all of the people that are paying that extra 40p in tax, that would only close the 2014 voting gap by 1/6. And yet we put so much effort into them.
Yeah.
So the answer is Commonweal, proper planning. There's no conflict whatsoever between mid-ranking public sector professionals like nurses, middle managers, and the working classes. If we do the right things in Scotland, everyone will benefit. It's not a reverse class war or a zero-sum game. We can lift people at those lower salary levels up a lot and still improve people for everyone. And that's the meaning behind the Commonweal slogan, all of us first. So I would just say, let's build a vision of the future that does that, that kickstarts economic recovery, but with well-being at its core for everyone. And let's start now. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Amanda. I mean, everybody here on this call who's been involved in campaigning will recognise the issues you've spoken about remembering 2014. And of course, the mainstream media focus on the things that affect the wealthy and the middle classes, don't they? The currency and all the rest of it. And the ordinary, you know, grassroots do not get a say. And this is what we're trying to address with the formation of Now Scotland. So this is part of that. So thanks very much. Thank you for that. And then the final speaker, before we go to questions from the audience, so I hope the audience is formulating the questions, is George Kerevan, who is the Now Scotland co-convener. George. Where's George?
Now Scotland was created last year in recognition of the fact that large numbers of the supporters of the independence movement had left the SNP, reformed autonomous yes groups across the country, and were looking for a lead. Now, that led us to think, how do we organise? We had relied very heavily on the SNP for 40 years, with all of the energy of the movement going through the SNP. But the SNP has been in government since 2007. And without, because Now Scotland is not a political organisation in terms of parties, it's for everyone, including SNP members, but we began to grapple with the problem that political parties enmeshed in government do not always give the lead to explaining and arguing for the case for independence, which has been the theme of the discussion so far. However, really what I want to say briefly, just to close this session, is that there is a nationality in the British Isles who are not represented here, and that is the English. And I do not think that we can break up and reform the governments of these islands without including the people in England, and particularly the English working class. If all we are trying to do is break off the Celtic edges, then we may not succeed. And even if we do, we are left with the major part of these islands in the hands of Boris Johnson and the Tories. And that we will live to regret that. So really my message in this evening is that we need a movement across these islands that breaks up the existing reactionary British state and allows the self-determination of the peoples of these islands. But that path thereafter has to be the cooperation between the peoples of these islands, not an enforced unity from London, but a unity from below. We can't achieve that without the people of England. Now, I think the reason that England is not represented here for the moment is that England historically has represented a reactionary ideology, the ideology of empire, exploitation. Now, in saying that, I don't let off the Celtic fringes. Scotland and the Scottish elite from 1707 onwards bought heavily into that project of a British empire and a slave empire. In fact, the Scots ran, I mean, the Scots actually provided the military and the managerial basis for running of that slave empire. But the interesting thing, of course, was in doing that, the Scottish elites turned their back on the notion of Scottish autonomy and a Scottish culture. And that identity of Scottishness was embraced by the early working class movement. And if you go back to the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you will find that the early trade unions marched under banners that proclaimed William Wallace and Robert the Bruce as an image and a model of fighting for freedom. These days we cringe at that sort of thing, but the early labour movement embraced a notion of Scottish Home Rule, and that's been ran all the way through. So actually, demands for Scottish self-determination have always been part and parcel of the workers' movement here. But England, if you look at England, there is that same, plebeian self-organisation from the Luddites, the Chartists, the early trade union movement at the end of the 19th century. England is not a lost cause. So my point I really want to reinforce is, we've been building our individual movements. We have to cooperate with each other to accelerate the breakup of this reactionary British state. But we also have to cooperate with people in England, the anti-austerity movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and so forth. If we don't do that, we run the risk of being defeated from the centre. And final point to say is, of course, we are meeting on May Day, the day where the working class across the world comes together, celebrates labour. Nations are not uniform. Nations are made of classes. And as I say, that it is the working class in Scotland that's always carried the banner for Scottish self-determination. And I'm sure that that's true in other parts of the UK. And we all, I'm sitting here in Edinburgh, the hometown of James Connolly. So we know that the unity of the labour movement and the demands for self-determination go together. So I'll end there, but the thing what we are trying to press forward with in Now Scotland is to unite the movement and unite the independence movement in action. And I think that's a good principle because it allows us to debate in the pub or debate at a political party level, but it still allows us to get on with the job of uniting the nation for the march towards self-determination. But that unity in action can be beyond simply each of our different nations. It can be a united march. Let's break up this reactionary British state and build a better home for all the nations of the UK.
Thanks very much, George. Okay, now it's over to our audience to ask questions. And I've got a few in the chat here. So what I think I'm going to do is ask a couple of questions, and then maybe, unless one of our speakers wants to come in, I'll ask one to maybe formulate an answer. But I'll start with these two questions. Firstly, and this might apply to all the areas we're talking about outside of England at some stage in the campaigns. When Johnson says no to a referendum, won't we need to stay on the streets and involve civil disobedience to force Indy Ref 2 or any referendum for separation? And secondly, if you think of tactics that the movement can use, why don't we call our MPs or our elected representatives out of the Parliament in order to campaign in the streets and make a point that it's undemocratic to ignore the democratically expressed will of the people through a referendum? So I suppose it's about tactics, isn't it? It's about tactics. How do we take these movements forward? In Scotland, obviously, we have a May the 6th election, which is a Scottish parliamentary election. We wouldn't like to predict exactly how that Parliament will be made up, but we are certainly hoping there's going to be a majority, an overall majority in the Parliament for independence supporting MSBs, be it SNP, be it Greens and ALBA, perhaps, we don't know yet. But nevertheless, we'll be in a position to move forward very, very quickly. Whether those parties that unite to allow that to happen, we don't know. But what do people think about the tactic of civil disobedience to get what we want as a movement? And secondly, can we think of tactically withdrawing our elected representatives to help in that movement? So Sean, do you want to have a go at answering that? Or one of those two questions?
I'll have a go. I think it's more pertinent for Scotland, so I won't take too long. It is a big question. It is the Catalonia example, which I would imagine a lot of the Tories and even people in the Labour Party UK-wide are thinking of. And it is a challenge because basically states adhere to the Westphalia Convention, which is, you don't really poach about, as you say in Wales, you don't put your nose in other states' business, and this is what Spain banked on. What I did find interesting is something I hadn't considered, and I don't know if you in Scotland have. I saw something in a paper yesterday or the day before that people across Europe are asking for the EU to recognise Scotland and to welcome an independent Scotland. Now, if that happens and is coordinated, that's a big thing. Now, I'm not so naive to say that it would definitely change the view of Westminster, but it's something they wouldn't have thought of, and it's something which they find very difficult to argue against, as that's one of the big tenets they have. So I think it'd be worth the Scottish movement certainly looking into that and see if they can. I'm not just of Scottish expats living in Berlin or whatever, but genuine, if I can put it like that, German people, French people who live in these countries supporting independent Scotland. And, to use a good German phrase, Schadenfreude, I wouldn't be surprised. A lot of people in the EU would love to give Westminster a bloody nose for what's happened with Brexit. So I think it would be quite a rich mind to see. From Wales's point of view, to some extent, the longer things drag out in Scotland, the better for us to be because we need to build up our movement. So we've got quite a way to go. I'm not under any illusion. So from our point of view, if you can drag it out just a bit, boys, we'd be very grateful. Not too long. Make sure it happens, but not like next year. So take get a few years, but that would be good for us because it does then sharpen people's minds. But I think it does, and to finish it does underline the importance of having a mass movement. And this is the importance. So the politics are absolutely fundamental. And I don't like people disparaging politicians. Some of them are total idiots, but most, I think, are mostly decent people. But you need the politicians to turn the key, which is the problem we have in Wales. We don't have the politicians of the party at the moment to turn the key. But you then need a mass movement, galvanised and ready to do things. And I think to start thinking outside the box. And I say guerrilla, not in a militarist point of view, but thinking in terms of guerrilla tactics, things which the British state wouldn't have thought of and would find difficult in having enough hammers to nail down all the different nails they need to nail down to sort it out.
Thank you, Sean. Well, hoping for something of a domino effect. If one of us goes first, the rest will follow. Absolutely. Gerry, do you want to contribute to that answer at all?
Yeah, civil disobedience. I think it's going to be necessary. Like I said at the start, Boris Johnson said last week, wasn't it? There's not going to be a border code for a long time. And you're even hearing people in the nationalist camp, if you want to put it that way, in the north, saying that it's not enough to have 51% to have a successful border poll. You need more than that. Numbers seem to be plucked from the air. So I think even the push back against Boris, or when Boris goes for his kind of shenanigans, whoever follows him, it's going to require civil disobedience, mass protests, people organising to push back and to say that there's the right to a border poll. Another one in Scotland, to have one in the north and south, is a basic democratic demand that people have a right to have a say in. It's enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement, but the problem with it is that it's under the discretion of the Secretary of State. So what better way to show Brandon Lewis that people in the north, more and more of them, are supporting a border poll, and to have mass protests, strikes, and civil disobedience, obviously. So I think it's an important question to kind of push back against the undemocratic tide that's kind of growing, and the kind of nervousness of, both liberals, people in the centre ground in the north who are, effectively pro-union, but also some of the nationalists who are quite politically timid and conservative in many ways. So I think that idea of mass protest is important. But also, I mean, I was kind of referring to it quickly at the end of my comments. I mean, we've seen big mobilisations north and south. You know, when there was an abortion referendum for repeal in the south of Ireland a couple of years ago, we had busloads of people from the north coming down. And after that successful referendum, yeah, the north is next was the demand. So we need to find a way to fuse those movements together to say, listen, this is about a vote on unity, but it's also about reimagining politics on the island, a new constitution, you know, going after the wealthy, tackling wealth inequality. You know, the south of Ireland is a tax haven for corporations. How do we tackle these questions and all these things? So I think mass mobilisation is going to be key to making those issues front and centre of any campaign. Otherwise, it's going to be just a kind of timid, corporate-looking campaign for United Ireland, which speaks to a certain audience, but that doesn't speak to everybody in the north of Ireland or the south.
Thanks. Yeah, speaking of timid campaigns, yeah, that's what's happening in Scotland now for this Parliament, unfortunately. Amanda, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I think there's a couple of things that I'd like to pick up on, and part of it is about George's stance on we must take England with us. So I remember our general election campaign in 2019 when we made a big effort about let's stop Brexit. And what we neglected in that phrasing is that the majority of people in England voted for Brexit. We currently have a government with a majority of 80 members in the House of Commons. And so it is not for us to tell England whether they should stand up for themselves or not. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice if we tie ourselves too closely in with this being a class situation and therefore asking the English working class to support us. I don't think we're going to make much progress there. I also think that in terms of civil disobedience, we have to be very careful on this one, partly because Scotland is very aware of what's happened in Northern Ireland, and it's interesting to hear Gerry talking about that. But it's also about the fact that we do not yet have a significant majority. So we can't be on the streets manning the barricades until we're sure that that is the will of the majority of people in Scotland. So we need to still step back a bit and work on getting people convinced that self-determination is going to make their lives better before we man the barricades. And I think that's really, really important. We talk about whether or not Westminster, or the Johnson government, would be able to prevent a referendum. But let's change the polling. You know, when it's just 1 or 2%, they might feel that they can say that. But when the majority of Scotland is firmly behind self-determination, I think we'll find a different story.
Okay, thank you. Garry, do you want to add anything to that before we move on to the next sort of questions?
Yeah, certainly. I think Kernow at this stage is probably that further stage back behind Wales in that sense. But one thing that we are going to be doing starting in September is actually organising a series under the Kernow AUOB banner of marches for Kernow, trying to, it's not going to be sort of like mass civil disobedience, but certainly involving families, involving communities, and getting those issues out there on the agenda. But that said, there is a growing emotional concern over property, a basic requirement. We're in a situation there with this mass development, new houses, new properties being built in Cornwall. We've got mass development outside our control, but at the same time, there's no genuinely affordable housing for local families. And that situation could actually get to boiling point very soon, because you've reached a stage where you've got estate agents contacting people to say, oh, can we sell your properties for you? But at the same time, families not really benefiting. And I think that situation, if it's not addressed, could actually lead to civil disobedience, personally.
Okay, thanks, Garry. George, you want to say something on this?
Briefly, we will not be successful anywhere, either within the individual nations or in a final confrontation with the British state, unless it is a mass movement. I think we all understand that. I disagree with Amanda. She's speaking in a personal capacity there, because as a board member of Commonweal, I take a different view. I think we may have to ramp up the mass movement in a way that catches the attention of the British state. I think civil disobedience will play a role in that. I think civil disobedience has to be very carefully prepared. I think it has to be mass civil disobedience and not adventurous actions by very few. But you know, we're a bit myopic in Scotland, because we forget that traditionally there's been a lot of civil disobedience in Scotland as part of the movement, going back to the 1960s and the first big wave of anti-Polaris demonstrations. So we've got a history of this, and I think it will come. I think also that we may have to look at Parliament. As an MP, the SNP group discussed a lot about how to disrupt Parliament. But our leadership was rather worried about doing that. So I think that may also come. But we need a bit more muscle in the movement.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, so there's quite a few questions coming in about the fact that, you know, whichever one of these nations seeks to have and hold their own referendum, that the British state will move very quickly to block it through the courts. We've already seen Boris Johnson's government attempt to do this with some laws that have been passed in the Scottish Parliament. He's challenged them in I believe, the Supreme Court. And one of the questions is there a UK constitution on which basis these laws are being challenged in the UK? Is there, because there is no UK constitution as far as we know. Therefore, on what legal basis are they challenging it? And this would apply to Ireland, it would apply to Cornwall, it would apply to Wales as well if they tried it, so that we've got some unity there in terms of the purpose of coming up with a solution to that. And another question, I'm just throwing two out there, so maybe you want to answer one but not the other. Given that there is a lot of rancor within this movement, never mind from people outside the movements to it, how do you combat the hate? The hate from the ruling party, the hate from the media, from social media, and whatever organisation you're in, whatever campaign you're in, how do we overcome that and foster unity? So there's two quite interesting questions there. One about challenging the British state who take recourse to illegal means to stop our self-determination, and the rancor and division in our own movement. How do we cope and combat that? Sean, do you want to maybe have a go at one of those?
Yeah, it is difficult, and also if there's lack of movement or lack of direction, people tend to fall out. So it's a big thing, especially for what we are, which is volunteer-based organisation. So if there is indiscipline or people fall out, you can't, like in a business, sack someone if they're saying something racist or whatever. You just ask them very politely to stop doing that, and maybe they have to be ejected from the movement. So having people feeling positive and feeling energized is going to be a challenge. And I would imagine that possibly would be the strategy of Westminster, maybe not to do anything, just to postpone it and kick it in the long grass. And we've seen this in Wales with campaigns for the language in the past, where things are just kicked for year after year after year. Certainly same situation in Northern Ireland now with the language act there, hoping that people just run out of steam. So in that case, I think we have to build ourselves for safe positions for that. So we need to make sure our movements are kept lively by things which are maybe not just political. So things like music, maybe things like sports, things which keep people energized, even when things politically may be fairly quiet for lots of different reasons. The other thing which I've been contemplating more just individually here is the need for having, and this is both a pro and against, different movements for independence. So I mean, and different types of independence. So I mean, every movement itself does have its own dynamic and its own personality and own personalities. And those can go through highs and troughs, which is natural with anything. And if there's only one movement, there's a danger then that, you know, if that movement for whatever reason is going through a tough time, then the whole national movement, if you like, can come down with it. So in that respect, I think it's important for us in Wales to have a plurality of movement for independence. So if one movement, maybe my movement, Yes Cymru, for whatever reasons, starts to go quiet or something, there's maybe 2 or 3 other movements which are maybe on different timescale and different type of facilities, and they can take up the slack then. So I think we need to be aware that this could be a very long campaign. I think it'd be worth talking to people in Catalonia about that. And there was an interesting Twitter thread in Welsh last week, which we retweeted on Thursday, I think, you know, about the situation in Quebec. So they're very, very close to winning. In '95, I remember hearing the vote, but now it seems it's gone very quiet. And, you know, that's something which is difficult. I think there is a difference between Quebec's position and us here in the British Isles, or whatever we call this archipelago, in that Quebec is the only nation in North America in that position. Whereas here we have Wales and Scotland, Ireland and Kernow at different positions, but arguing for the same thing. And that creates a different kind of dynamic to what is happening in North America, Quebec and Canada. So I think we need to have diversity of views. I think it's a good idea to have diversity of groups as well, if that's managed. But I think we need to have a long-term strategy for keeping people involved and activated and paying the membership when things are maybe quiet.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Gerry?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go for the second question, Charlotte.
Fair enough.
Definitely not an expert or a novice, to be honest. Yeah, well, suppose like you were kind of asking about sort of unity, I think, and how do you kind of, I think, have people not sort of turn lumps out of each other. Maybe it was the kind of sentiment of what you were getting across. And maybe that's more of a Scottish question in terms of, like, you know, you have different sort of movements and different sort of strands, different organizations. We're at a different situation in Ireland, you know, where we have, I think, certainly from our point of view, we're trying to carve out a different left position for ending the border. You know, we have parties like Sinn Féin, which are, you know, in the main and the biggest party pressing for unity. You know, they're in government in the north. They're, you know, possibly the next government in the south. They're opposition and the largest opposition party. And we're obviously, you know, we work with them in different gauges where we can. But for us, it's important, I think, to try and not have a politically sectarian approach, but have an independent approach from them, which says, listen, people are right to be distrustful of parties, including Sinn Féin and government, and their policies and their practices and what they implemented. And I can keep us here at 12 o'clock tonight talking about those. I'll not do that. But it's important that we have an approach which says, okay, we may agree on voting in the ballot box on any potential border poll, but you have to have a, you know, from our vantage point, a distinct left-wing alternative approach, and we're in the process of, you know, forming that. We had a excellent conference last weekend, and, you know, George and others spoke at it. So I think it's important for us to kind of have an approach in Ireland which is, you know, independent of the big blocks. And I'm sure I missed out some of your question, but that will be my answer for now. Thanks.
That's okay. Probably forgotten some of it myself. Amanda, do you want to?
So tell me which bit. Maybe you should just clarify the situation regarding civil disobedience a little bit. It's not that it's never suitable. It's just that we need to go through certain processes. And so Weal says quite clearly that this is about elevating the levels at which we protest. So one of the probably most annoying things to the Westminster government that this Scottish government has done is fly the EU flag outside of Hollywood. Mm. And it's these little irritants that are a type of of expressing our discontent. But we need, what Commonweal's position is that we actually need majority support, because without that, then we're not really speaking from a position of strength. So yes, as a last resort, civil disobedience, non-violent civil disobedience is absolutely right there. But we have to hope that next week we'll end up with a pro-independence parliament, and then we can start to do all sorts of things that would allow us to express both our disquiet, but also to try and show that Scotland is not governable with the majority of people in favour of independence. And I think that bit comes before the civil disobedience on the strength. Although I do notice that in the chat, somebody had mentioned XR, and I think they've done an excellent job of non-violent civil disobedience that brings them to public attention. So there's obviously a balance with all of this.
Yes.
Regarding the EU, I would as well say that since we are currently out, to go back into the EU without having a proper debate and discussion about the best position for Scotland would not be acceptable. We know that there are different ways of engaging. We know that we are really missing the export opportunities and everything else. And regarding the petition to the EU to support Scotland, we have to remember that the EU is basically a massive trading bloc where capitalism is very important. And the fact that they would ignore a market the size of England to give some kind of preference to Scotland, I think is just making things up. At any point, when given a choice between supporting a big market and a smaller market, they're going to go with the people that they know and that they've dealt with for a long time and who are customers for their businesses. So I'm not saying that it wouldn't be possible for Scotland to make arrangements with the EU, but it maybe isn't the only solution that we can have in terms of access to markets. And I don't think that we can at this point expect major sympathy from the EU, although individual European politicians may be very supportive of Scotland. That's a very different thing from EU treaties.
Yeah, thank you. Garry, do you want to say something about these issues? I notice how everyone's dodging the thing about the UK challenging our right to determine.
Yeah, I think I've got problems with I think one of the things that's come out of this discussion as well is actually that issue of democracy. Because I think increasingly, for example, in Wales, it's talking about Welsh democracy, Scottish democracy, in order for that sense of identity to be articulated, articulate our democratic rights. And one of the things, another initiative that I'm associated with is called Cornish Democracy. And that's part regional project, part community based. And that's ensuring that the community genuinely gets involved in that process. On the constitutional point of view, we've been talking to one or two academics from Wales about whether there should be a Cornish constitution. It might seem outlandish to some people, but on the other hand, every society would have its own annual general meeting, its constitution. So why not Cornwall? And that's one of the things that we've actually been looking at, is trying to safeguard our rights, to defend our language, to defend our culture, and to defend our land. And by going down that constitutional and democratic route, is we also want to actually come out, but bring out too in working with other organisations and learning from other countries as well. Like I said, I'll stop.
Okay, thanks. George, do you want to finish up this little bit about these questions?
Yeah. Civil disobedience doesn't mean just being, disruptive. I think we need a bit more humour. I mean, there's some wonderful examples of democratic movements in Eastern Central Europe that have made a lot of use of humour and just been run-footing the opposition by sending them up. And I mean, Scots can be a bit dour about their politics too. So I think there's a whole range of ways of being creative about how we reposition the movement that we should explore. But in the end, it's a very simple problem. Why are the English and the British elite so desperate to hold on to the Celtic fringes? I mean, what do they get out of it? And it's clearly something within the psychology and ideology of the ruling elite at Westminster. And there's been lots of discussion. I mean, the Financial Times has pieces every week on Scottish independence. They're obsessed with it. And obviously they feel this would be a final blow to their prestige on a world scale. And they're worried about the military implications, particularly in Scotland, which is like the top third of of Britain, and it has lots of links to the strategic passages in the north. So maybe we should be trying to chisel into some of the stupidities of why the British ruling class is desperate to hold on to what's left of its empire, and try and make that a public debate within England. Because when you consider it long enough, I mean, it's like the story I think we heard earlier on. In England, they don't want us to go, but why? And so I think our whole strategy has to be based on trying to expose the limitations of the argument from down south. And maybe we've been too much concerned with looking at if you get independence in Scotland, you'll be £50 a week richer. An economic argument, rather than trying to look at some of the politics of the thing and where we'll go in the future.
Okay, thanks. I would like to take some direct questions from our audience, and on the Zoom call, the way that you can do that is if you go to the bottom of your page and click on, I think it's reactions, you can press the button raise hand, and then I'll see that and I will bring you in to ask your question directly to the panel. So can I see some raised hands? Give you a minute or two, maybe give the panel a bit of a break. And just to say, we're 297 live just now between Facebook and YouTube, which is excellent for a bank holiday weekend, Saturday night. So that's great. So anybody here, hands up, or I'll just revert back to the questions that people have put in the chat. Robert has his hand raised. Right, hang on, I need to find Robert. Where are you, Robert? Let's see. I don't see Robert here. I'll take the next person who've got their hands
I'm here,
raised.
sorry, yeah.
All right, on you go, Robert, sorry.
Right, I put this question in a text, but it probably came a bit long-winded. I mean, one thing that has really changed, I think, in Scotland in the last 10 years is the principle that the people in Scotland have the right of self-determination has become very real to people. When maybe 20 years ago, it was rather abstract and vague and, not crucial, but now it's very real. Now, it's absurd. If the people in Scotland have the right of self-determination, then that right must reside in Scotland with the Scottish people, with the Scottish Parliament. It's absurd for the right to exercise self-determination to be controlled by another country outside, which is larger. Now, it's not necessarily the biggest argument in our campaign, but it's perhaps quite an important one to drive home this point that it's a ridiculous situation that self-determination for Scotland resides outside the country. And so we need to affirm that. I mean, it would be awfully nice if we could get the Parliament at Westminster to transfer that right to exercise self-determination through a referendum, to transfer that permanently to Holyrood, so that Holyrood can decide when it's going to, if and when it's going to have a referendum. Now, it's unlikely that Westminster will do that, but surely at least Holyrood can pass a bill that affirms that Scotland has self-determination and make it clear that it's ridiculous and affirm that that must reside within Scotland. Now, surely that could be relevant in Wales as well. Driving home this point that the Welsh people, the people in Wales, have the right of self-determination. Now, it's not quite getting to the stage in Wales, probably, that it's got to in Scotland, but hopefully it will soon. Right, so surely we need to emphasise this a bit more in our argument. And even if we can't get Westminster to transfer that right to Holyrood, to campaign for it, to drive it home.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Anyone of our panel want to respond to that before I take the next question from the audience? There was a question in there somewhere. If you listen, if you don't, I'm going to just go to the next person in the audience. Thank you, Robert, for that. We'll get an answer to you. John Brown.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not wanting to get hung up in constitutionalism. Things happen as they happen. The biggest problem that I see for Scotland getting independence is the continuing existence of the Labour Party. But if you think that 50% of current trade union membership in Scotland supports independence and that 40% of the Labour Party membership in Scotland are at least not hostile to independence, this will be the same kind of question for Wales as well, lesser extent probably Gerry and Ireland. How do we deal with it? It's the Labour Party we need to deal with, not the Tories. Their vote is relatively stable and will continue to be stable. We need to deal with the Labour Party and people who still have a residual affection or loyalty to the Labour Party. They're the people we need to defeat.
Okay, thank you, John. George, you want to have a go at maybe addressing those issues? Sorry to spring that on you.
I came across some interesting information the last 24 hours. A colleague of mine in the media was trailing Anas Sarwar around Glasgow yesterday on his bus. And he was talking to some of the voters who had come out to see Sarwar. And he asked them how they were going to vote. And they said, Labour 1, Alba 2. So there is, forgive me, I'm not punting Alba anymore. I'm just trying to point out that there are curiosities and there are within the Labour vote in Scotland. It's clearly not hostile in the main. Even Labour supporters are not hostile in the main to self-determination if it's presented in the right way. What they're clearly concerned with is what kind of Scotland there will be if we have independence. And that has been the kind of subterranean debate inside the national movement for the last 3 or 4 years. In particular, how do we reach out to independence-leaning Labour voters who voted against EU membership, and equally within the support for the SNP, there were, tens and tens of thousands of working class supporters of the SNP who voted for Brexit and who have been put off in the last 2 years as the SNP leadership embraced in a kind of manic fashion all things all bright and beautiful within the EU, when we all know that the EU, whether or not you want to be part of it, has serious, implications for small nations. If you look at the austerity that was imposed on Ireland and on the Mediterranean countries. So the point about how do we, it's absolutely certain we have to win over Labour voters. I think the way you destroy the right-wing Labour leadership and anti self-determination leadership in the Scottish Labour Party is not by attacking it's not to clear the Labour Party away as as a kind of the enemy. is to how do we reach into those Labour voters? And I think the way you do that is to have a much more, as Amanda was saying, people will vote for independence if they know what it really, really entails. And I think, therefore, we have to come up with a genuine, radical policy for social justice, climate change, really changing people's lives and empowering people at an individual level. The SNP leadership, many people think they've not been doing that recently. They have drifted to the right. That's the debate we have to have. So, bottom line, how do we deal with the Labour Party? We actually have to be. We have to show that an independent Scotland will be anti-capitalist, will take determined efforts to deal with climate change and not just create new markets for big business. That we will actually create a Scotland which is democratic from the bottom up, and not just a change of who's exploiting ordinary people in Scotland.
Okay, thanks, George. Amanda, do you want to comment about any of those points that Robert and John made?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. A long time ago, I was a Labour Party member, and most of the people that I was a member of the Labour Party with are independence leaning, even though if they are still in the party. And I think we need to address the issue that this government has not been particularly pro-social justice or accepted all of the things that Labour Party members would like to see. If we had a more radical agenda, and if we followed some of the Common Weal plans for this, it would be a lot easier. I notice a big difference, though, with Labour Party members that I've been speaking to, that they have changed their mind with the change of leadership across the UK Labour Party. That there is less support for a Starmer-led Labour Party than there was even under Corbyn. And that is about what people are looking for in terms of their politics. And really, as an independence movement, we have to be explaining that this is about putting all of us first. This is not continuing the neoliberalism of Charlotte Street Partners and the Growth Commission, but that the vision for Scotland is actually much fairer and more about equality and about a different economic path that actually puts the environment, the new Green Deal and everything else first and foremost, because that's what we all need to see coming for Scotland.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Sean, you actually in Wales have a Labour dominant in the Welsh Assembly, don't you?
Yeah, and this is it's a big question for us. There's loads of different reasons why Wales is different to Scotland. Maybe not enough time now. Labour is probably going to be the biggest party in Thursday. We have supporters who are in the Labour Party and will still be in the Labour Party, even though they support independence. How they square that circle, sometimes I don't understand personally, especially as Mark Drakeford, who I think is well respected. Adam Price, Pride Committee, just said that in a debate on Thursday night. They thought, by and large, he agreed with what he'd done. Disagreed with things in principle, but other things he agreed with. They managed to somehow keep on board a lot of people, I think, who are supportive of independence and people who are against. And that's quite a trick. So I think there's still a lot of people in Wales who sort of, there's a strong cultural vote. And I think it's important to discuss this. I mean, I think a lot of it, certainly in Wales, is a cultural vote, not just an economic one. So I think people are voting how they feel about the party culturally more than what the actual economic arguments are, even if they're in their favour. In Yes Cymru, the way we've tried to get around that is in a way just recognise that Wales is diverse and we try and celebrate the culture that is there, not the one as we wish, if you like, but obviously we try and promote things which are of Wales. I think there's a question I think we need to address also as a panel here is, and the more I think about it, part of the success of Yes Cymru has been, for the last 5 years, the Labour Party in the UK has been very weak and been divided, and there's been battered by the Conservative Party at different times. There is certainly a section in Wales of people who are Corbynist, who feel disillusioned with Labour. Maybe they're seeing this Cymru as kind of as a vehicle for change. So I think that's certainly what happens if the Labour Party in the UK become popular again or more popular. Could be a challenge for us, because I think certainly in Wales there's this constituency people within the Cymru and the broad independence movement. Maybe not people who are 100%, no, they're 90% with us now. But if they felt maybe that the UK could be reformed, they would say, okay, or maybe this is what happened with Quebec and Canada, I'm not too sure. They would go, okay, well, that's an easier and less, in inverted commas, risky route. I think it's a very difficult route for Labour, because Tories are going to change electoral boundaries, which means we're losing 8 seats in Wales. I think it's essentially the Tories win about 24 seats in England. So I think there's a huge mountain to climb, but nothing is impossible. And I can see the Tory party collapsing. I think at the moment, I think they held together UK level by some kind of mirage of a sort of the Wizard of Oz. Once people see that it has no claws, it's just some bloke shouting in the background, I think the collapse could become very quick for Tories. So I think we need to think of that as well, how we would challenge, how we would deal with that situation.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question from our audience, just to make sure that she gets a chance to contribute before I ask Garry and Gerry back in. So Florence, do you want to unmute yourself? Hi, Florence.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Do you think that a supermajority, if it actually materialises, will be a benefit to our movement, when in fact the Parliament will not be representative of the people, as we're only at 50-50? I'm very worried that it might really annoy quite a lot of soft no's and even soft yesers, and think that we're doing something that's wrong, that it's not correct. We're not building up the case for independence first.
Okay, thanks, Florence. It's a very sort of Scottish specific question. Perhaps, George, I need to go to you for that one, as the term supermajority has been mentioned by Florence. Maybe our other colleagues on the panel don't know what that is. Thank you, Florence. You can lower your hand.
Those who don't know, a supermajority is the argument that we shouldn't just be seeking in the Holyrood election to win a majority for the independence parties, but we should try and win as large a majority as we can, squeeze the London Unionist parties. Now, I'm in a little bit of a bind here, because I'm here with my Now Scotland hat on, and Now Scotland is non-party political. It's to unite the whole movement, and so Now Scotland does not have a position on majorities. It's trying to unite all the Indy family in a practical activity to get the case across for independence, which we all agree needs to be built up and get well over 60%. However, if I'm forgiven, and I'll try and be as even-handed as I can, the part of the movement, and particularly people around Alba Party, are in favour of a supermajority. The starting point is actually twofold. One, that the existing machinery for electing Holyrood was deliberately rigged by unionist parties to ensure, the reason why it's not first past the post, for instance, is to ensure, and the reason is this kind of horrible mixture of first past the post and the Hoyt system, to deliberately ensure that no single party can get a majority. And that was built in order to ensure that the SNP could never be in a position to claim all the seats, majority of the seats, and therefore claim a mandate for negotiating independence. So if we start with a flawed, biased system deliberately created to thwart the will of the people, then okay, fine, come, let's take it on. We'll use it to the advantage of the Scottish people if we can. So I don't have a problem with doing it. But there's a more sophisticated answer. the way the debate for independence in Scotland has been polarised over the last half dozen years is between the SNP, in particular the leader of the SNP, and London and Westminster and Boris Johnson. And many in the movement think that that's a wrong way of putting the argument, because it's bound to lead to, I mean, charismatic politician to charismatic politician. I mean, that thwarts the need to discuss. It's very anti-Scottish, which is, the laity of all the people, democracy and whatnot. So some of us believe that the way the debate for independence should now be readdressed is between the Scottish Parliament in its entirety, not the party, but the Parliament, as the elected will of the sovereign people of Scotland, that Parliament should say, we represent Scotland, we are the sovereign will of Scotland, we have been elected, we demand negotiations on independence. So the basis for negotiation is not, can we have another referendum, please, Mr. Johnson? We are very nice people, please give us a referendum. It is the people of Scotland, the sovereign people of Scotland, have elected a parliament and you will negotiate it with it. And that, I think, you reinforce by having as many people elected who support the sovereignty of the Scottish people and the right to self-determination. And I make no bones about I will game the system to achieve that. Now, will that upset some people? Yes, it will. But we have to, at some point, get off our knees. And nobody's talking about anything other than democracy. But here's the democratic system given to us by Westminster. Well, we're going to use it. Let's use it to elect as many people who represent the sovereignty of the people of Scotland and demand from day one that negotiations now take place. And after those negotiations, then we can have an affirmative referendum. So what ALBA will do, and if there are SNP members here, hopefully they'll come forward. I'm not trying to hog the limelight. But what ALBA will do if we have members after May the 6th is we will instantly put down a motion saying we've had a plebiscite referendum, election. The people of Scotland have voted for a majority home rule parliament, independence parliament. We now demand that Westminster negotiate with us and take it from there.
Okay, thanks, George. Garry, do you want to make a contribution to this part? Even though it seems somewhat Scottish specific, but.
Yeah, I think I might go back to that earlier discussion, which does link into this in terms of the nature of practical party politics. Because in order for independent revolution to actually go through, it needs to take into account the politics. And this is just linking this to Cornwall. This is where we have a particular problem. Because in 2005, every parliamentary seat in Cornwall was held by the Liberal Democrats, who were in favour of devolution. With the Cameron coalition, their support collapsed, well, not collapsed. Suddenly they lost a lot of support from the Labour Party, which means we've now got a Conservative Party facing more fragmented opposition. And that's the problem that we've actually got in how to negotiate that situation. Every single parliamentary seat held by the Conservatives, but on the majority of the total vote. But in the elections, we still currently have a Liberal Democrat independent coalition, which is at least is supportive. The question is, what will happen if there's a Conservative majority? I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. Gerry, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I think there's a super majority of a kind of different kind, maybe in the north, maybe not that it out and the B2 abstract, but I was kind of referring to it at the start, where you have someone in the sort of mainstream and sort of conservative nationalist, Irish nationalist movement in the north who are kind of saying that 51% or 52% will not be enough. You have to have either something higher than that, and sometimes they specify it should be 2/3 or 70% or something to that effect. And that's obviously, first of all, undemocratic because majority decision should rule the day in any referendum, elections, or whatever. And it's really trying to shift the parameters to say that what is acceptable. It's also trying to appease unionism and loyalism in many different ways. And it's something that, you know, I think socialists or Democrats or people on the left shouldn't accept at all. And also, you know, just think about this. You know, there's a lot of talk about violence in the north recently, about, you know, mostly centered around sort of paramilitaries from the loyalist end and kind of pushing people out to riot and, you know, cause trouble. You know, people have been told that, you know, through the procedures of the Good Friday Agreement, and we can get into that, you know, criticize that if we want, maybe at a different meeting. But if you're told to people that the democratic route to United Ireland is through, you know, a border poll, a referendum, and 51% vote, and you're now saying that that's now cut off, then people who have maybe dangerous tactics, different tactics, and, you know, maybe, you know, I'm talking about people who are engaged in armed action, paramilitary action, may draw the conclusion that the only way to get Irish independence or Irish unity is that strategy. So obviously that's not our strategy. We're for, you know, peaceful civil disobedience and people before profit, but it's very, very concerning that that's kind of a conception that's being you know, talked about quite openly by many in the sort of liberal establishment, mainstream nationalism and others. So I appreciate that's not Scotland's supermajority, but I think there's a warning signal that people should be aware of. I think in Scotland that's being talked about.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question of the panel, and then I'm going to ask them to sum up. And that is, we've touched on this in different parts of the discussion so far tonight, and somebody has asked, how important are the social issues of opposing austerity, scrapping Trident, and opposing climate change? How important are these in the dissolving of the British state? You might be aware that in Scotland we have some people who say, don't talk about anything except independence, and these other issues can be addressed after, and therefore, you know, it's a mistake. So that's a good question. What importance do you put on these other issues as impacting on the move towards independence? And some of you have already mentioned some of that before, but anyway, I'll come to Amanda. Do you want to have a go at that one?
I'd love to. That's what I'm all about. So first of all, I just wanted to refer back a little bit about Labour. Scottish Labour's best chance of electoral success is actually independence.
Agreed.
Because if they want to put Labour policies into place, then they would have much more opportunity to do so in an independent Scotland. And regarding the supermajority, let's not forget that that mechanism was put into place by UK parties, and it was designed to prevent a majority. And yet, despite that, we still have an overwhelming return of pro-independence politicians at Holyrood. And I think it's really important that we think about that. So unless people vote, there won't be a supermajority. A supermajority will prove that there is a majority for people that want independence. And I think that's very important. And then coming on to the social issues and how important are they? I firmly believe, and Weal believes, that actually the uncertainty about independence is because people want clear-cut plans. They want to know what will happen. So it can't just be an Indy-only strategy and we'll sort it all out afterwards. People deserve and need to know, well, what will we do about this policy if we get independence? And that's what our Common Home Plan and our Starting a New Country book are all about. This talks about all of the issues that people need reassurance on in order to be able to be comfortable voting for independence. And the constitutional argument does not sway voters. The constitutional argument is very airy-fairy. People want to know what it means to them and their household budgets. They need to know what it means to them in terms of their mortgage or their pensions or their rent. And it's really, really important that we give them a route map of what independence means in terms of how it will affect their lives. And that, I think, is what hasn't been clear enough to date. And that's how we actually get greater support for self-determination and independence.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. Sean, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, this is the big question we're having, and it's I think it's a difficult question to know where the lines to draw. And I think in Yes Cymru we've decided on some moral principles, if you like, which we can stick to in terms of being anti-racist and accepting people from different backgrounds. And you know, that's a big debate, and people have differences about that, and we've seen that also in Scotland. But I think those are sort of a basis which we build a movement on. In terms of individual policies, we've decided not to go down that route. I think what we've tried to do is to give a steer where someone looking at the movement can say, okay, we can see broadly where the direction of travel is within Yes Cymru. Maybe we're in a different stage, maybe in 2 years' time, a different situation. There's another movement in Wales called Undod, which is Welsh for Unity. And Undod is more left-wing, something more similar to Commonweal, I think, in Scotland. I think they've been in discussion with them as well, which gives a more precise steer on kind of policies we can have. So I think Yes Cymru has decided, certainly for the time being, not to give definite policies, if you like, about what independent Wales would look like. We give suggestions of kind of things we could be doing, and we'll take it from there. Maybe that's to do, as I said, because of where we are in Wales, and we're still building up the whole idea of independence. We have a little booklet called Independence in Your Pocket, which is also free as a PDF on our website, which again answers a lot of questions. We produce some information about GDP and stuff like that. But this is something we've decided that politicians, people standing election, need to come up with. If that keeps in the future, that's a different question, but that's where we are at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Garry?
I think greater autonomy in the case of course must be seen as the key in all these issues, whether it's addressing issues of planning, whether it's addressing issues of housing, social justice, human opportunities. I think really speaking to people, in fact, personal experience recently out on the campaign trail, that's what really matters to them. One thing that Cornwall is obviously sufficiently small enough to be, is that the community takes control of its own affairs. And that just means sort of like great devolution, autonomy, independence, or whatever to Cornwall, but those empowerment families and communities at the local level. So yeah, I think it's got to be seen as the key. We get power in order to actually change lives for the better.
Thank you. George?
With my No Scotland hat on, No Scotland, like Yes Cymru, had a discussion about whether we should have political positions on key policy elements. And we decided we couldn't because we want to embrace the whole of the indie movement. Of course, we should discuss policy, but and how we deal with poverty, how we deal with climate change, but that should be within the parties or in other structures. We are a movement that's about action. Nevertheless, people don't vote as individuals. I mean, the weakness of middle-class democracy as it's been imposed on us for the last 100 years is it makes people vote as individuals, and then you have this this bun fight between the parties. We'll give you £5 extra, we'll cut your tax by £15. Real democracy is democracy of nations and groups and classes, and how we change society and how we manage society. So now Scotland felt that we had to accept that the the centre of gravity of social concern in Scotland. And I say this in a very kind of gingerly fashion, but the centre of gravity of politics has always been, because it's a mass, it's basically a working class society, with a very narrow elite at the top. The centre of gravity of politics has been social democratic. So therefore we wrote into the Constitution of Now Scotland some very general positions about the kind of Scotland that we wanted to see. One that had social justice and fairness at its heart. One that was committed to genuinely dealing with climate change. One that respected human rights. So fascists need not apply. So I think there is a recognition in Now Scotland that we're not just for independence as a constitutional niceness. We want independence to do something with society, because that's what Scottish society wants. But if you're going to have unity in action, you have to respect the fact that lots of people have different ideas of how we will resolve that. So Now Scotland is basically a movement of the left, the social democratic left, because that is what Scotland is in its heart. Not to say that we have resolved all of our issues, which we have not, otherwise we wouldn't need independence in order to deal with that. Right, bottom line is, I think most people in the independence movement feel this is, we want independence for something, to get the levers of power that can deal with inequality, lack of human justice, climate change, and so on. And that's what makes achieving independence quickly a vital necessity.
Thanks, George. Gerry?
Yeah, I think the questions around trade and all those kind of economic and political questions are important, not just for, you know, an independent Scotland and United Ireland, but day-to-day functioning of life in the north. I mean, just to kind of tease that out, we have a situation where we've got a Sinn Féin finance minister, Conor Murphy, who's offering public sector workers a 1% pay offer, not an increase, obviously, a pay offer. This is after people have worked through the pandemic. This is after people have, you know, worked harder than ever. People have been forced to pay for more electricity, gas, you know, all these things at home. And, you know, the finance minister is saying that there's not enough money there in the Black Grant from the north. And obviously that, you know, I think there's a whole history of, you know, Sinn Féin, DUP and other ministers not, you know, pushing back against Tory austerity and doing a, you know, a rotten job of implementing it. But, you know, if you have trade scrapped, you've got, last figure, I think it's tens or hundreds of billions of pounds, which could be redirected into, you know, communities in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Belfast, Derry, Cardiff, Swansea, and everywhere else in between. So I think it's a fundamental issue. Just if I can as well, quickly, Charlotte, somebody, I think it was Mairead, was asking about Arlene Foster stepping aside or being forced out and what that will mean. I mean, it's hard to predict, but her likely successor is somebody who believes that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. Who's he's a creationist who believes in sort of so-called, or certainly doesn't oppose so-called gay conversion therapy and all sorts of other horrible issues. And obviously that's obviously problematic and dangerous in many ways. And you know, what the DUP are going to try to do is likely move things to the right because of the pressure they're being put under, because of the connection they have with Boris Johnson, because of the protocol that they ultimately delivered, and they're being attacked politically in their communities. But also it's kind of it's not a foregone conclusion in the sense that, you know, there's a sorry, somebody's posting in the chat there. There's an idea that Arlene Foster was kind of liberal and Poots was more right wing, but they've all believed in the same thing for many years. So I think what happens is certainly unclear, but there is a concern that, you know, Poots and people like him may try to sort of stoke further division. And I think in that context, we need obviously to see, you know, working class unity, people coming together to push back to say that, you know, the DUP facilitated the Tories in government for many years, facilitated Theresa May and her ilk, facilitated, you know, poverty wages for people in UK and also in the north. So I think that's part of our task going forward. And, you know, certainly nobody's celebrating Poots going into office and possibly being the first minister for the north. You know, what a wonderful thing. But that's going to create a backlash, and people are going to be you know, quite opposed to that, and hopefully that's something that can be organised in the near future.
Thanks. Yeah, sometimes you have to pinch yourself and remind yourself this is the 21st century when you hear of some of the opinions of some of our political representatives. I'm going to ask the people in the panel to sum up briefly, but before I do that, firstly, I want to thank them for being here tonight, giving up a Saturday night. And I particularly want to thank those who are not from Scotland, because sometimes it's a bit difficult to cope, you know, answer questions that are being put in a sort of Scottish context. So thank you very much. I hope we can return the favour sometime in the not too distant future. And this has been a Zoom meeting organised by Now Scotland, and George mentioned that he's a co-convener. I'm on the committee, the interim committee that set it up. And we are very much for the grassroots organisation of the Indie movement, because we do feel, for all the reasons that people have talked about, the top-down nature of the political parties, the lack of vision in the campaign, certainly this election campaign will not be celebrated as one which has put forward much of a vision for the future of Scotland. And we hope to give a voice to grassroots people, not just in Scotland, but all over the world, who want to contribute to the fight for Scottish independence. But we are an activist group, and we are a group that has included in our mission statement an urgency about independence, because on all sorts of issues, not least austerity, not least climate emergency, we don't have time to wait. We don't have time to wait another 5, 6, 7 years for independence, so that we can get these levers to make life better for people in Scotland, and I think consequently elsewhere too. So we want to be focusing now as an organisation on what do we do? What do we do as activists? This time next week, basically, when we will know the composition of that Scottish Parliament, we want to be hitting the streets in making the call for IndyRef2 now. Today, some of our supporters all over Scotland in small numbers have been taking part in demonstrations, flag banner drops, flag waving, placing yes stones, taking photos. We had a big demonstration that all under one banner organised in George Square today in Edinburgh. We've worked alongside other organisations like the STUC. We've advertised their events today, and so we are working in parallel with people to promote the idea of IndyRef2 and independence to a much wider audience. And we hope that our work with the organisations represented here are going to help that and help them as well as we go forward. So if you are in this call and you're not a member of Now Scotland, can I recommend that you go to our website, where you can join up and be a member, get information, you can liaise with other people in the independence movement, you can post your own events and things like that. And as this movement grows, that website will develop. But the key thing is to keep the pressure on. We cannot rely on the politicians to deliver this for us. And I think most of the panel would agree with that completely. So thank you very much to the panel for being here tonight. Solidarity to everyone out there. And I am going to call our panel in this order: Amanda, George, Gerry, Sean, and Garry, to just a couple of minutes to sum up. Okay, Amanda, do you want to kick off?
Absolutely, thank you. Commonweal has done a vast amount of work since 2014, talking about some of the biggest ideas and looking at a vision for a better Scotland. And actually, there's some reassurance in that, because at least 3 of the parties standing in our election next week have included Commonweal ideas in their manifestos. So that feels great. But, you know, really, we had a meeting of our Commonweal local groups. That's local groups from across Scotland that I met with this week on Zoom. And what they said was they're making progress, not by talking about independence, but actually by talking about the issues. These big policy ideas that we should be debating are gaining more traction at grassroots level that could then move people towards Indy. So it's important that we don't just talk about the Constitution. We put out a paper before the election in trying to encourage people to talk about a resilient recovery, to talk about a Green New Deal, or about a new democracy and what that could look like, or a national care service for Scotland, or land reform, or housing, and how we actually take control back of these things. And also to look at the situation beyond devolution. You know, we need to get independence right. And we need people to understand that we have a plan for getting independence right. So, and part of that is probably, you know, not believing that the markets know best and leaving everything to the capitalists. We need to make sure that we can produce the best outcomes for everybody, but especially those who are not doing well currently. And by harnessing their support, we can bring about a much better Scotland where everybody is put first. And I hope very much that you will join me in supporting these themes that Commonweal is putting forward, but also I would welcome any engagement if you want to follow up with Commonweal. The website is commonweal.scot, or you can email me, amanda@common.scot. We really need to be having these conversations, not just in forums like this, but as things open up, we need to be having these conversations with our neighbours, the people who are not currently politically engaged. We need to be talking to them about the difference that this vision could make to their lives. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. George.
I think we have done something modestly historic this evening in bringing the four nations together and sharing ideas. And I got a lot from it, and I may move to Wales. I think we should continue this dialogue. I think our individual movements are strengthened by sharing ideas and sharing perspectives. And, you know, if you're just doing it in one part of the UK, you can go up blind alleys. So this has been very, very useful. There's information we can share. There's ways of campaigning we can share. There's literature we can share. And I hope in the mythical post-pandemic era, we can maybe physically get together, you know, go to the four nations and meet physically. So I think this has been really, really, really useful. My final point is we face power structures. This is not just a debate about ideas. People vote. There are power structures in the British state which will try and thwart genuine democracy in the nations. So it's a tough fight. Now Scotland is about unity within Scotland, but I now see that we're also going to embrace unity across the nation. So really good discussion.
Thank you, George. Gerry?
Yeah, thanks. Just can't say really to George. I think it was a good conversation. I learned a lot as well, and happy to keep the conversation going. And just to say, I think it's sorry, it's my dog barking. I think it's the elections in Scotland. If that returns a bigger majority or a majority for independence, then the next conversation is obviously for yourselves is Indy Ref 2, but for us, it's going to be border poll in Ireland is going to be sped up, and there's been articles in the Belfast Telegraph and others kind of saying that if Scotland goes, the north is quite inevitable, and sort of connection historically of Ulster people from a Protestant background to Scotland and all that. So I think it's something that is going to speed up quite rapidly, and for us in the north, we have to understand that, and that's something that's going to be something that we can kind of connect from the north to Scotland, and to say the reasons why people are pushing for independence in Scotland are obviously varied, but from what I hear tonight and what I've heard throughout the different campaigns is that people want that economic control, they want an end to austerity, an end to war, and kind of a more progressive and left and radical, and for many, a socialist Scotland, and I think those conversations can feed back into what we're trying to do in the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland as well. So I suppose whilst you are maybe toasting or I don't know how you may celebrate or end the election. I know you're all different groups and whatnot, but it's going to sort of speed up in Scotland speed up in the north. And obviously, that might have a initial negative impulse. There could be an increase in loyalist, rioting and backlash because the British state has seemed to be, or the union has seemed to be disintegrating, and that may be a reality for us to grapple with. But obviously, it'll speed up the question for United Ireland, and that's something that I think is fantastic and welcome. So thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerry. Sean?
Yes, I tend to agree with what's been said. I think to some extent we can just do what we can do. So the things which is outside our control, certainly here in Wales, we have an election next week. I'm not too sure how it's going to go. We also have an election for the Yes Cymru National Committee, Central Committee at the end of May, this month. I will still be chair. Nobody contended that post. You can make of that what you wish. I think it's a combination of nobody wanted to do the job and maybe I don't vote of confidence in my work on to show. So I'll still be here. Yma as we say in Welsh. And I think it'd be worth us meeting up after our respective elections when we have a better idea maybe how the dust is settled. From Yes Cymru's point of view, in that election, we're hoping that we will now go a system where half the membership of the Central Committee, 12 people, will be women, so there'll be equal representation there. We're also building into that committee representation from the BAME community and GTR, gay and lesbian groups as well, so that we're hoping to build into our movement a reflection of our society. That doesn't decide how policies work, but that's our part of hopefully showing the people kind of ways we want to see in the future. But certainly I think in a few months' time, it would be worth us meeting up and seeing what needs to be done. I think we are looking at you, Scotland. Don't let us down. So no pressure, boys.
No pressure.
I think it is going to be fundamental because I think, as Gerry said, if Scotland seems to be going, that switches a lot of lights on here in Wales as well. So there's a lot of groundwork. I think at the moment, a lot of people who are quite like the idea of independence, they still got a lot of questions to ask. They haven't quite jumped into the water yet, but the movement is starting. And I say we'll be going out on the streets, hopefully in August, traveling around towns in Wales, literally with like a fun bus, if you like, meeting people. We're also looking at gigs and more stuff online, which has been very successful as well in podcasts. So I think we need to meet up maybe September-ish or June, depends how it goes, and see where we can take things from there.
Thanks very much, Sean. Thank you. Garry, going to finish us off there.
Well, thanks for inviting me. And it's good to actually find people, similar ideas, similar experiences, and we in Kernow can only benefit from learning from that. And as we start to go on our own journey with Kernow AUOB, first demonstrations, March for Kernow planned for September, it's all really good. One thing I think we should need to consider, and it was mentioned earlier about Britain. Britain of one form or another will still continue. And I think we should actually try to put a positive mindset on this. It's about actually taking power away from Westminster and the elites and giving it to the people. And I think we need to show people there's nothing to be afraid. We all benefit. We can benefit from recognising diversity, tackling social and economic problems, and I think we should actually be the ones that take the lead in doing that.
Thanks very much. And thanks again to all our panel Really, really interesting, really, really exciting times, I think. I think that we are part of a global movement. I think that all over the world, people are looking at the consequences of neoliberal politics, of globalization, and saying, no, we don't want it. Now, they might be finding different answers to that. And some places, such as Myanmar, it's a coup that kept keeping the people down. There was a young woman from Myanmar who spoke at the All Under One Banner rally today in George Square. Very, very moving, and made the comment that she supported Scottish independence for the same fundamental reasons that she wants freedom in Myanmar. And that's what millions of people throughout the world are fighting for. And we are part of that. Although we don't have the army in the street yet, we nevertheless are fighting for freedoms and democracy, which are denied so many people. And I think that if we do manage to break this chain, then these other nations will fall like dominoes. I'm quite optimistic about that. But in the first instance, we need to get into the streets to get the voice of the grassroots of this movement heard much more widely. And I'm sure that everybody on this panel will help us do that. Everybody who's been in the audience today will help us do that in a safe way, because we're still living with COVID and maybe for some time, but nevertheless, let's get into the streets and get our voice heard. Let's take inspiration from Black Lives Matter, from Extinction Rebellion, from the people who are protesting about the Kill the Bill, the police bill, which is a horror of a bill that will curtail all our freedoms, I believe, if it comes into pass, including in Scotland, not just in England and Wales. It will have an effect, for example, in COP26. So let's get unity in this movement, and unity for action, not unity for waiting around much longer for the freedoms that we all deserve. Thank you very much to our audience. Keep active. Thanks to our panel. Stay safe, and go to Now Scotland to find a bit more out about us. You can join us for as little as £2, and you'll be part of this fantastic movement that we're trying to build. Thanks very much. And thanks to our tech team for helping out in the background. They never get seen. Thank you. Stay safe.